think the challenge is to decide for yourself, not, what's the next thing that just came along, but, what is it that you really want to spend your time working on, especially as a junior scholar when you're developing your own reputation, developing your own kind of foundation for the rest of your career.
Welcome, David, to the Journeys of Scholars.
Thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to our discussion.
It's great having you, Dave. So while academia is a perfect place to sharpen our research abilities towards excellence, it tends to be sort of less helpful. It's about mentoring and managing our sort of wider context outside of these networks that you might be sort of sitting in. So this conversation is really going to be about, how your perspectives about managing the wider context of where, we grow towards mastery. And so more concretely, we'll be talking a bit about your trajectory, your choices through your career, perhaps a bit of your private situation, and then, some micro strategies about growing towards excellence. So, David, you're the professor at the Department of Sociology and Sociology at University of California. You're also the faculty director of the Social Science D Lab. I think the D is standing for data science, I'm guessing.
Well, just data more generally.
Data more generally. Fantastic.
But we do a lot of data science.
And so previously you were at University of Michigan, and you hold a graduate degree in sociology from Harvard University. And your research, among other things, is about the study of poverty, inequality, urban neighborhoods, and incarceration, focusing a bit more on the US context. You use both qualitative and quantitative methods, and then you have a special interest in causal inference for contextual effects. And so your work appears in the American Journal of Sociology, the American Sociological Review, and the American Journal of Epidemiology, Nature Human Behavior, amongst others. And you've also written several books, some of them appearing and published with publishers such as University of Chicago Press and Russel Sage Foundation. You've also received numerous awards. For example, in 2014, the William Julius Wilson Early Career Award from the Inequality, Poverty, and Mobility section, right, at the American Sociological Association. In 2012, for the Outstanding Book Award from the same section for your book, Living the Drama. So one of the things, David, looking at your career and your publication portfolio is really the diversity of publication and publication venues that you've been able to sort of target. And so, many social scientists tend to select one of the paths in terms of, the book formats or the journal article formats. Those two paths are obviously not mutually exclusive, but the style of writing, the packaging of ideas are somewhat different across these two venues. And even the audience can differ to some extent. In the book market, you'll have probably more of a dedicated audience in the topic of interest compared to an article where, people that just, remotely might be interested in the topic might still read the article. So in evaluating a publication record, you've really found a way to balance these two. It's like I'm seeing, the books coming out and the articles coming out, and I mean, on the one hand, you have the several important books that you've edited, both edited volumes and books as such. The latest is After Prison, published in 2020, and then the other one is 2019, was On the Outside, right, if I'm correct. And then, on the other hand, you have all these great publications in AJS, ASR, Nature Human Behavior. And really not only that, you're also leading a lot of the articles that you write. And so one of the, things that you hear often is that the seniority grows, you sort of end up in the backseat of the research, not so much perhaps composing the articles themselves. So really my opening question here is, what's the secret sauce behind managing the thinking, the writing process, and arranging, your days for writing?
Yeah, I wish I had a real secret sauce. I think, the most important thing is just protecting your writing time. I mean, obviously your writing time is not just sitting in and typing out sentences,
Hmm.
but it's really kind of thinking time. And also kind of making full use of your entire research team, which is often about kind of being able to assess, where different students or postdocs are in their own development, and what can they easily do, and what's the next thing to try to push them to do, and then help them to develop those skills. I mean, that's really the way I think about that sort of more collaborative team-based work. And most of my work these days is with some combination of students or postdocs. I mean, another maybe small tip is to think about what tasks can be broken into those small chunks that you have, half an hour here and there between meetings and classes and writing emails. You can outline a section of a paper in half an hour, even if it's inconceivable to start writing, and have to pick, and then dropping it again. So, and really reserving your blocks of time for deep writing and thinking. I try to block out these days 1 day a week, which often gets intruded into by other things, unfortunately, with more administrative responsibilities. But that's the best I can say in terms of time management. It's sort of using your own time effectively, but also trying to make sure that the people you're working with, that their time is used effectively as well, so that they, they're using it efficiently when they need help. They get it, so they can keep moving.
Right, but it seems like one day a week and a day that gets intruded, it's really not enough to, if I'm looking again at publication record, it must be something else going on in terms of discipline or deep focus. I mean, if we think about perhaps just deciphering this one day a week, if we go a little bit into the micro part of this conversation, maybe heading on there. So how do you, if you walk us through just a regular day, a regular week of yours, how does it generally look like?
Yeah, I mean, these days I do have a lot of administrative responsibility, so I think if you look a few years from now, my productivity will, on the research side, will look a little bit less. That's my guess. But on a writing day, I mean, one of the things I try to do when I have a writing day is make sure that I'm ready to write as soon as I get to my desk, right? So
interesting.
I've got the night before or the day before, I'm sort of getting everything together, so I'm not messing around trying to find something, or if there's things I can plan out a little bit, or even at the end of the day before, just sort of going back over the last thing I wrote, right? So that I can hit the ground running. Obviously, summers are summers in the American context are important too, for having a little bit more time to write.
Right.
I use this. I'm an outliner, so I certainly, I talk to my students about, some people really need to write in order to think, and other people are more an outliner style. And part of what I tell my students is you need to figure out which of those you are, and face your own work process on that. So I'm definitely kind of an outline beforehand, and then sit down and bang it out, and then I have to let it sit for a while, and then go back to it and revise it. But knowing that's sort of my work process is what allows me to use time efficiently. Whereas someone who's more of a think by writer, right, they just got to sit down and start writing and really be comfortable with writing out what their thoughts, and then going back to it much more intensively later.
So the writing, the writing to think type of people is really using the writing to really, through the writing, thinking about the logic and perhaps, that might yield a outline in the end, or it's like but you seem to be having, sort of a clear thought, and throughout I don't know, you're sitting in seminars, you're sitting, talking to people, things are sort of digesting in your mind, and then it's almost ready to be outlined as a logical, coherent sort of story, right?
Almost. Yeah. I mean, certainly that maybe maybe we would say I'm a think by outliner rather than think by writer.
I see.
Well, I still need that prep time, but yeah, it just sort of flows a little bit differently.
And so how detailed would your outlines be? Would they be like at the paragraph level, or are we talking, I mean, if you're doing sentences,
yeah, probably at the paragraph level.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing I would say I've developed is, my own style of writing, like say an article, for example. Like I have a way where, if I'm targeting like a sociology journal, right, I have almost like a template that I use to write the introduction.
Oh,
right?
interesting.
It's a generic. I actually give this template to my students, with an example, So, but that just comes from experience, right? I mean, the first time you do something, it takes you a very long time, and the 10th time or the 20th time, it's much more efficient. That applies to writing, teaching, whatever we do.
Yeah, sure.
So.
And so the blocking off time, so how does it, you try to like, is there like a minimum of half an hour of a chunk, or is it an hour of a chunk, or 2 hours a chunk? Like what's the, the usual way that you try to break down a day so that you can create this time?
Oh yeah, a real writing day. I mean, I think I have to have like 3 or even 4 hours straight to really get much writing done. Even if even when I've done that preparation, it still takes a little while to get into the flow. Often I find myself at the end of the day, most writing most efficiently, and then time's up.
Sure.
But,
and emailing and stuff like that, people calling in, would you shut down everything and try to just be really focused, so you keep it open, given that you have some other
I have to not schedule any Zoom meetings. Like I don't have an open Zoom link or anything for people to connect to when they need me. And I have to like shut down my email when I write.
And so, okay, so that's interesting. So if we think about the writing process as a, as a skill to develop, have you always been like writing in general that you feel like it came easy in the beginning, or something that you've developed consciously, or
No, I wouldn't say it came easy at the beginning. It is something that you have to develop over time, and yeah, I think you're right. Sort of be conscious and deliberate about, and everything has its own style, right? Which isn't some sort of inherently, the structure of a sociology journal article isn't like inherently the right way to do something, right? In some logical sense, it's just a convention. And what your readers as reviewers and eventually article readers are used to seeing, right? So they can digest and pull the information out of it that they want. So and then I've also written papers, usually with collaborators in journals in other fields, whether it's criminology or epi or applied statistics. So of course when I'm working with those collaborators in those fields, I rely on them to sort of teach me how to write for that sort of audience. Another strategy that I use when I'm sort of writing in a format that I haven't written in before is to find a few pieces that are written in that format with that journal, or maybe you're writing an op-ed for a newspaper or something like that, right? Take a few that you like that are maybe similar, like if op-eds, you find other op-eds that are written by academics about their research, right? And actually do what people call like a reverse outline, where you take the text and you say like, if let me just distill it down to the key points in the order, so I can really see the logical structure,
right?
That's sort of the convention in this particular writing format, right? And often I ask my students to do that when they're writing in a new format, to take this piece or that piece and make a reverse outline, and then that helps you see the structure you're shooting for.
And so you mentioned these different disciplines, and obviously writing for epidemiology or statistics, or even this interdisciplinary journals such as Nature, Human Behavior, quite different, and also book format. Do you have any conscious strategy in terms of thinking about when to engage for an article versus a longer term or energy demanding book?
Yeah. And that's a bigger discussion. It's certainly most big projects I do, I'm sort of aiming for a series of articles plus plus eventually a book. The book format is one in which you can sustain a much larger argument, right? A much larger story arc. You have the space, especially with qualitative data, to really present a lot more of that data in a lot more kind of nuanced way, and really sort of bring the people who are participants in the project, bring their perspectives and their experiences into much greater depth. And that, so that's often the motivation for doing a book project. Though it is also possible to write a book based purely on quantitative data. It's harder to do, I've found. Right, you have to find other ways of producing a compelling story arc that way, because you don't have the characters to hold the reader, right?
Oh, I see. Yeah, I was going to ask why is that so? But then you the characters aren't as easily depicted in a quantitative data set. That's probably it, right?
Right. Yeah, and in fact, that was in the After Prison book that we published in 2020, which is a book I worked on with Heather Harris, who's at the Public Policy Institute of California now. And it's based entirely on quantitative research, and we have a few other students who wrote particular chapters on different topics. But one of the challenges was like how to make it as engaging as a book.
I see.
If we have sort of our academic story, but how do you make it engaging as a book? And what we realized is that was a project that was based on administrative data, largely sort of various linked records of administrative data. The administrative data was incredibly detailed. And what we ended up doing was actually selecting individual people who showed up in the administrative data.
Oh, interesting.
And normally when we analyze data quantitatively, we're looking for patterns across, right? I mean, we developed of course our argument and our findings quantitatively, and then on top of that, so we layered individual stories of people in the administrative data. And the administrative data was actually so detailed, exactly what happened to them on different dates and how they're engaging, for example, in the labor market and with the criminal justice system and their housing and family situations. We were able to write sort of narratives about people, of course, in a way that wouldn't reveal who they were. We would have to sort of make the details a little bit fuzzy in certain cases where it would be identifying, to sort of layer on the narrative piece.
So essentially, you picked one interesting row or two, and then you worked through the columns, basically describing their life history or context or what happened to them without actually interviewing them, right? So you
right.
Okay, that's really smart.
And Heather did the details of that work, and she did a great job of sort of digesting all those details and putting them into a narrative that would just sort of like tell the same story as the quantitative data, and it would almost like illustrate the story that the quantitative data was telling.
I see. That's really smart. So then and thinking about the book, so you said okay, so how do you balance? I was asking, how do you balance articles and books, and you said well, I always think in terms of a series of articles and then perhaps one book as a final crown of the project. So, and that seems like a deliberate strategy that you have used throughout your project. So how do you set up this longer term goal, and also making sure that you hit those shorter term goals, which is what an article represents, and an article itself, we know it can take several years to write.
Yes.
So how, there must be some kind of a synergy effect that you've been able to tap into, right? And what would that, how do you get at that synergy effect?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think you, in a sense, use the process of writing articles as a way of helping you kind of construct the larger story that links them together. So the articles are kind of a first, articles, of course, you have to be very narrow and specific, right? And so I mean, I tend to let those kind of unfold as they go. Okay, what's the first main headline of our findings here, right? And let's present that in an article format. I also tend not exclusively to write, when I'm doing these mixed methods projects, to do the quantitative pieces of it in articles and the qualitative pieces in book format.
Okay.
But I do have some qualitative articles as well. And so then that gives you, when you go to write the book, right, you can you don't have to, you can pull the points from the articles that you need, right, and give just enough detail to to justify that point and move on in the book.
What would you say? I think that's like a terrific recipe. So what would you say to those, in the audience asking like, oh, but how much would you, copy paste from a article and put it into the book to sort of feed into some of the logic? Like what would your response be to that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think there's definitely quite a bit of overlap between the books and the articles if you read them side by side. I don't know if I would say copy paste, but at least the intellectual ideas, right? The book is almost putting together, connecting together some of the key ideas that are coming out in the articles. And as you said earlier, for a different kind of audience, right? It's an audience that's going to be, maybe within your discipline or other academics, who aren't interested in the details or the very particular topic area you're working in, right? So someone who studies maybe inequality might not be interested in reading the details of a paper on housing instability among people coming out of prison,
right?
But if that is a key part of a book about the prisoner reentry process and how it relates to inequality, then that's where they're gonna see it.
I see. I'm starting to see how that. So in terms of managing ideas in text, I mean, seems like quite of a a feat to be able to like have the chunk of ideas flowing in the book and then perhaps in the articles and the series. Like practically speaking, how do you keep? I'm assuming that you actually have a quite extensive notebook. You're a notes taker. I'm just guessing now, but perhaps not. But then how do you manage that? How, like maybe software wise, you can just walk us through a little bit, or even hand notes or whatnot.
Yeah, I'm not one who uses a lot of specialized software other than just citation management software. I keep a lot of notes in Google Docs and things like that these days, especially when we're working on collaborative projects. All of our team projects have these sort of long running Google Docs where we keep our team brainstorming and our notes and things like that. So I haven't quite found some magical technical solution to this sort of thing.
Yeah. Fair enough. And thinking about, because these longer projects, you have articles and your books. I mean, there are many other interesting ideas, I believe, floating around that you have to say no to be able to sustain the core trajectory of these articles. What's your, like, walk us through your logic of how you think about when to say no to other projects to make sure you actually realize.
I wish I was better at that. I'm like the kid in the candy store metaphor. It is hard to say no when a new project comes along.
Yeah.
Largely because, like, to me, the most interesting and fun part of a project is at the beginning, right? It's like planning the research design,
Yeah.
starting to collect the data, starting to see the patterns that are coming in the data.
Yeah.
And then the process of writing, writing it all up in the end after you figured it out in your head and you know what the story is, and
Exactly.
And then getting it all down and getting it through review. That's the least fun part of the project. But I think these days, because almost any project I do is collaborative with students, postdocs, or other scholars, that's a big part of the decision-making process. If there's something that another junior scholar is like really excited to work on and is willing to sort of get the ball rolling, then that can that can be the motivation for getting something going. And the interesting thing about that is, once you have tenure, you're yourself on a little bit of a different timeline, right? Things can take a little bit longer to develop, but students and postdocs aren't on that timeline, right? They have an immediate timeline for the job market. So that's I guess, back to one of your earlier questions, now that I think about it, that's also what kind of keeps things moving, is that their professional timelines are different from ours, right?
Yeah. I mean, they sort of, to some extent, are a core part of the engine, or sort of catalyst of engines for projects and to lead things forward. And so actually collaborations in general is really a good question. You bring that up as another theme for this conversation, is how to think about collaboration. And you have as I alluded to in the beginning of our conversation, is that you're leading a lot of these articles still. I mean, my guess is that you're just looking roughly about 50%, give and take a couple of percents here. But what's your idea about like leading versus sitting in the back seat here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends a little bit on the project and who I'm collaborating with, and at what stage they're at, and what what venue we're targeting. In general, I guess I have if we're working on a paper, I kind of have a rule of thumb that I talk through with my collaborators, especially students and postdocs, right? Because they're often don't feel comfortable asking, those kind of questions straight out. And the rule of thumb is that the person who writes the first draft of the paper should be the first author.
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, what's the rule of thumb here? Okay, that's it.
And so I generally try to work in kind of the way that I was trained, which is this kind of apprenticeship model, where, especially somebody early in graduate school, they get involved in a project or a series of projects, and the first paper they're working on, they're learning the ropes of just, how does this all work? Like, how do they put this all together?
Exactly.
Maybe they're doing the data analysis, or they're writing up a section like the methods or something like that. And so the ideal scenario is they're second or third author on a first paper, so they kind of see how the sausage gets made. And then hopefully then they're taking the lead on the next one, and so on after that. So they're sort of stepping up their responsibility, and hopefully learning that process of writing as well, through that process, and seeing their work get edited by others, and being really conscious of how it's changed.
I see. And so, and it sounds like, postdocs generally that you work with are then probably more interested in leading that first paper draft, and then you'll be
postdocs are more ready to just take the lead.
And can I say, are you you lead a lab or a team that you actually consciously hiring and working with, or is this sort of serendipitously jumping in and out of projects that or how does it, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it tends to be sort of more project by project. So I don't have, I don't have one lab that where everybody's kind of working together necessarily. I might have one project I'm doing with person A and B, and another project I'm doing with person C, D, and E, and some of that is connected to the social science D lab you mentioned earlier, some of which is students from the sociology department.
Sure. And they have like their own funding, or you with your collaborators brought in the funding and then you hire them, or is it like often that they are, they have their own thing going on and then they want to collaborate, so they'll jump on a collaboration?
Yeah, it's almost all the time there's some sort of funding. We try to raise funds for some sort of funding for them. Some students are already on a fellowship or a traineeship. And it's more, they're doing something for 10 hours a week or 8 hours a week, and fund them more hourly. For other students, they need a 20-hour a week position that's going to fund their tuition and fees and so on. Those are much harder to come by, much more expensive to raise the funds for, of course.
Sure, I see, understand. And so,
in the American university context and at Berkeley, with the cost of living, any way we can get funding to our students to keep them focused on their studies.
Right. So they will be usually faculty funded, like meaning that there are funding already in the departments that they will be hired on. Right. It's not like, so in Sweden, for example, where I'm based, is that you have to bring in, oftentimes you have to bring in soft money, to project money, basically, to hire PhDs and postdocs. There will be some PhD positions assigned, with the hard money that is already coming with the department, but those are just few.
Yeah, those are fewer. I mean, certainly postdocs we do have to fund ourselves, but our students, typically come in with a funding package that's not attached to any particular faculty member. That's some combination of campus fellowships and then teaching. And so, if they're doing research on top of those things, then we also pay them for that.
I see.
Time.
Yeah, that makes sense. And for those that are, on the stepping stone of building their own team or setting up, they're sort of transitioning from, postdoc to assistant professorship, perhaps going to associate professorship, where they're sort of in the process of building their network, or perhaps a team or a lab. Do you have an advice to think about, like, the composition of postdocs, PhDs or master level students or bachelor, like, in terms of how to build a lab?
Yeah. I mean, I think the most important thing to realize is that when you're building a lab and collaborating, you're doing it in part to get the research done, but in part as a teaching, mentoring, and training. And so that means, there are, especially, I would say this is especially the case for assistant professors who, have fewer other responsibilities besides their research and their teaching. I often tell early assistant professors, many times when you hire a graduate student to do something, you could probably do it yourself much more efficiently. And just to remember that when you bring those students on, you're taking on a training and a teaching responsibility as well. And I often tell assistant professors, and I think I operated this way myself in the first few years as assistant professor, that my goal is to get my work done, and assistant professors in their first few years shouldn't feel a strong responsibility to be mentoring a lot of students or bringing a lot of students into their research teams. Your main goal then is to get your dissertation turned into a series of papers or a book. And then it's maybe that next big project where I would recommend people start to bring on research assistants. I mean, there are some types of project where you just have to have research assistants, whether there's a lot of data cleaning and coding and things like that, of course. but that's generally.
Hmm. And postdocs in this equation, like if you were an assistant professor, it sounds reasonable to say, you should probably hold off a little bit with building too many mentorship relationship with PhD students. But if one would say, oh, but Dave, I have a postdoc. Should I work with this postdoc? Can I have some funding? Should I hire a postdoc to work with me?
Yeah, it's not. It's not a bad idea. I think if as assistant professor you can actually attract postdocs to your projects and raise enough funding for them. In the American context, where the cost of a postdoc is often not that much more than the cost of a 50% time graduate student because of the recovering their tuition and fees in addition to their salary. And so obviously a postdoc comes with more skills and experience. So I wouldn't say that if you could attract someone who was compatible, but you also don't know how compatible you are with someone until you really start working with them. So
exactly.
There's always a little bit of a risk there.
Yeah. I mean, the risk is really sort of compatibility, but also this sort of process that Adam Grant's right in his book Give and Take, which is sort of this personality types where his organization psychologist sort of categorizes takers, matchers, and givers. Basically, the gist is that these ideal types are basically you have those that give more in a collaboration, and you have those that sort of tend to take more, and then those that tend to match. Basically, oh, you wrote this, I write that. And this is like an ideal type that stretches across any human domain, I would say, and family relationships and writing and even sports and so on.
Sure.
So how does that play, and how do you manage those different personalities that you might be encountering in a collaboration like these?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point of working with students is that they're especially early on, you sort of expect them, they're sort of supposed to be the takers, right? They're supposed to be getting a lot out of it. And so it's also, I guess I also think of it as, there's averages. At my level, it's such a weirdly quantitative way of thinking about it, but the productivity that comes from collaborations, like some are going to be low and some are going to be really high, and it just sort of will average out in the end. But that's obviously a luxury for someone who already has tenure. But I think in working with individual students to sort of maximize their what they're able to contribute to a project, which is really important for making them enjoy the process of doing the research as well, and feel like they're getting something out of it, is really just try to both match their skills with the tasks you give them, but also then sort of incrementally ratcheting that up. Right. It's hard to it can be hard to calibrate.
There is a lot of variation, and then
different students start at different places. They have have different undergraduate experiences, and so
right. And in terms of this, I mean, what I noticed that you said that a lot of basically graduate students should be more of a takers, and to some extent you can think about some of sort of answers in the opposite way. They should be giving more, in the sense that they should give more in terms of doing the data cleaning, doing the analyses, even writing the first draft. But I noticed that you said like it was actually the reverse, which is quite interesting. If you elaborate a little bit more, the logic that I believe is sort of tying to what you said earlier about actually mentoring them.
I think I guess the metric I'm using when we're talking about givers and takers is I guess is all relevant to my own time, right? Obviously they're giving a lot of their time, and they are contributing to the project, but someone who's first starting to do something they've never done before, they need someone to spend a lot of time with them, going over the work and learning how they can do it better, or just figuring out what the next step is, how to do it more efficiently, whether that's, doing an analysis, coding, qualitative data, cleaning statistical data, or even, writing. And, often drafts going back and forth. We're in the drafting stage where the student has written something. And, sometimes it's at the point where it just sort of needs line edits, but sometimes it's at the point where, the feedback they need is someone to read it carefully and say, you know what, I see the ideas, they're all there, but try to rewrite it in this structure just because this is the conventional structure we're writing for, and they haven't written in that structure before. And that, that takes time.
I like what you're saying. It's like, you can measure giving in terms of time or measure giving in terms of expertise, and those things aren't necessarily, correlated, or even that's actually giving time in terms of expertise. It took you like 10 years to build expertise. So that 10 minutes of feedback might seem little, but those 10 minutes are backed up by 10 years of experience, just roughly speaking. So I think that's a quite interesting and important point to keep in mind. But also in terms, like, how often does it happen that a master's student or graduate student in general would be in their first years actually writing something that came out of their master thesis or something before the PhD that gets published more or less with some reworking?
I mean, in our program, that is actually the ideal. That's what we're shooting for, that they they write their master's paper in their second, third year of graduate school. So in our program, the program is designed for people who only have an undergraduate degree and are coming in, right? So they don't, I mean, some of them do come in with master's degrees, but especially in other areas, but we're really kind of starting from scratch in graduate school. So by the second or third year, they're writing their MA paper. It's based on some data collection and data analysis, and then there's a version that's sufficient to count as the MA degree hurdle, and then there's another set of revisions before journal submission. But in this kind of competitive environment we're in now in academia, it's really important for students to get that MA paper.
That's great.
Published as a journal article.
And how often does that, like, if you would, the average of say 10 students would, how many end up in a publication, and how many of those end up like in the top journals?
I mean, not. I'm just ballparking, guessing here, but
sure, absolutely, it's a hard question. You don't have the data.
2/3 to 3/4 eventually end up, as a publication. Maybe only 1 out of 10 at, a real top tier journal. But that's okay. But I mean, part of it is also, getting something on your CV and just sort of learning that whole process, right? And seeing it through, and then as they're going on to, formulate their dissertation or write another paper, right? They've learned from that process.
Sure. And so, if we move on and talk about this sort of, you mentioned this apprenticeship model where you sort of as a student, but also as a mentor, you take that deliberate role, and thinking about this sort of building towards mastery. No one is born with those skills, right? It takes time to build skills, and academia is also an area where you need to be good in so many different dimensions. Like, it's writing, it's the methods, it's the actual substantive fields, and networking, if you want to add to that, maybe social media, and so on and so forth. So how do you think about trying to optimize your time, and maybe it's like a model? How do you think about building mastery in this sort of multi-dimensional space?
I mean, I think the only way in my mind to really build mastery at something is to do it. So often if there's something new that I want to learn, I have to set up a situation where I'm sort of forced to prioritize that. And in my life, that means either doing, like, say, I want to learn, I want to work in a new literature, or I want to learn a new method, right?
Yeah.
It's doing a project that will force me to do that. Ideally, hope with a collaborator who
Yeah.
already has some of that skill set. So
Yeah.
I'm learning from them in the process. But it can also happen in teaching as well, right? If we see sort of a lot of papers being published with a new methodology, and we want to, incorporate it into our methods course, right? It can be a pretty heavy lift, but it is a way to force having to explain it to somebody else, right? It really forces you to internalize the fundamentals and the intuition.
Yeah. So I noticed from your work is that you have this substantive expertise in the field of poverty in the U.S., incarceration, and also that you worked on qualitative methods, but also a bunch of causal inference methodologies that aren't very common in sociology in general. We had the interview with Chris Winship and Felix Elwart on that topic, and so in sociology this is not like the common thing, but yet you have invested a bit of time in that. So what's that? How have you gone about like incorporating that in your research, but also maintain depth in both sort of methods and substantive field?
Yeah, I think it's I guess the way I think about my role is, I'm not creating or inventing any of these methodologies. Often what I'm doing is reading about what other scholars have written about them in other fields, whether it's in econometrics or stat or biostat, and figuring out how to translate them into sociology. Figuring out, well, how to just literally translate the language that they're using into the language that sociologists can understand, because we have our own particular jargon, and figuring out how to apply it. And so you could read a good number of my papers that are about causal inference or use causal inference methods as not just as substantive papers, but almost as pedagogical papers that say, okay, here's a methodology that we think sociologists should be aware of and know how to use, and here's an application of it in the sociological domain. So a lot of the neighborhood effects, contextual effects, quantitative stuff with Felix Elwart and Jeff Wadke. Those papers could be read in that way.
Yeah, interesting. And so because you do have several publications in sociological methods of research and sociological methodology. I believe you sit on an editorial board there. So a lot of those pieces, are they mainly translation work, or are there any additional developments of a method that a methodologist would actually find interesting?
I guess I would say they're probably mostly translation work.
Really interesting. Okay.
Yeah. I would be hard pressed to think of papers on my own CV that say a statistician would read and they would think, oh, I haven't seen that method before. Or it is really that translation work of not just like how can we translate the methods in a way that sociologists can understand, but how do we show sociologists how to use that method, how to apply it in a particular substantive domain?
I see.
How do these methodological ideas connect to the substantive or theoretical ideas that we have?
I see. And so, like seeing a future for, what is the future for someone, in say sociology, that will be like maybe extra interested in methods and perhaps, wanting to invest a little bit more in the sense that, perhaps they want to be something like a sociometrician equivalent to an econometrician or biostatistician. Sociology is not perhaps so conducive to that, particular profile. My sense is maybe I'm wrong here, so please feel to correct me. But what would you say to those scholars?
Yeah, I mean, I think we could go around the discipline and we could name people who have that kind of profile. I think you can't only write those kind of papers, right? But that can be an important part of your work. But it does have to have kind of substantive or theoretical payoff as well, and that is the challenging part of it, right? To connect. The ideal paper is one that says, here's a methodology, or maybe even more of a methodological strategy from another discipline that we can adapt here to answer a fundamental question that we care about as sociologists, or provide a better answer to that question, perhaps. So in terms of how to do that, I guess the way that I learned to do that was having the opportunity in graduate school to spend time immersed in some environments with these scholars from other disciplines, whether it was economists in the policy school environment, or statisticians and biostatisticians in more of workshops and and things like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, which brings me a bit about your early journey when you selected sociology as a discipline. I believe you took a BA at Princeton in sociology, and an MA 2002, and then later you took a PhD 2005, which is actually just 3 years in between the MA and the PhD. So that's that's just a speedy finish. But tell us a little bit about your like, why did you select sociology as a topic? And also in your committee, you had Chris Winship and Robert Sampson, Christopher Jenks, amongst others. I believe Catherine Newman was also in the committee.
Yes, she was the chair.
She was the chair. Okay. Am I right in saying Chris Winship might have been your main supervisor, or maybe not?
I was
one of the causal inference guys, please.
Yeah, I was very fortunate in graduate school to actually connect first with all three of us. So with Sandy Jenks, with Chris Winship, and Catherine Newman. Robert Sampson didn't come to the Harvard until after I had started the dissertation, and then also connected with him then, given the obvious overlap in the topics we were working on. I had the fortune of collaborating with all three of those people on research projects. So I had the funding to have the time to do that, and was able to make those connections with them. And all three of them were very generous about essentially using this apprenticeship model that I've now kind of internalized, and we talked a lot about, right? Okay. So that's where it all, for me, at least where it all comes from.
Okay.
So working with Catherine Newman on those qualitative projects, she's originally trained as an anthropologist, and working with Sandy Jenks on more kind of quantitative projects that are more kind of policy oriented, or publicly facing, sort of motivated more by specific social problems, and then with Chris Winship on the causal inference. So I don't know if Felix and Chris told you, but the three of us had I think a year-long reading group on causal inference in our the second year of graduate school for me and Felix.
Interesting.
Where we read through Rosenbaum's work, we read through not all of, but most of a lot of Pearl's work, and that was sort of really, really foundational.
Oh, that's and that was. I mean, Chris was coming out of. He was flirting with economics to some extent. I know he was a postdoc, James Heckman. That's how he sort of ended up actually getting a job in sociology, but it wasn't clear that he will be a sociologist. And you can listen to that interview separately. But for you, sociology, what was that? Why,
so when I applied to college, I thought I was going to be an architect, actually. And I applied only to colleges with architecture programs. Fortunately for me, I ended up selecting one which was an architecture major and not, going straight through to an MA in architecture. And in that process, I realized that, what I was interested about architecture was like how people use the space rather than so much designing space. And I didn't have any exposure to sociology before college. So I ended up taking a sociology course, and then I guess I fell in love with it. Really, to me, it's the combination of the thinking carefully and deeply about social problems and how to solve them and what their origins are with research design and methodology, and really like how do we really know what we think we know about these things. So I did a senior thesis, and I said, if I enjoy the process, the day-to-day work of doing this senior thesis as an undergraduate, then I'm gonna go to graduate school. And I did. So and I chose I guess I chose the program at Harvard because it had this sort of sociology and social policy piece of it, which was connected to my interest in
which is really what you have today. Looking at your portfolio of research is really flourishing of that of that early sort of work. And so what was, one, for example, for me, when I've been engaged with causal inference and Chris was my mentor as a postdoc there. It was, the lure of going into the whole causal inference analytical framework is it's very easy to sort of get, I wouldn't say stuck, but it's so well defined compared to, say, the sociological world, where it's all messy and very hard. So it's quite easy, I would say, mentally at least, for some maybe some type of personalities to just continue ahead with that path of going even deeper down the causal inference rabbit hole. But you've been able to sort of balance that, and so how did you not end up just doing causal inference, perhaps?
Yeah, part of it was the qualitative side of the work, and really seeing the importance of both, more inductive ways of thinking about research on the qualitative side, and and I guess at the end of the day, really wanting to understand things substantively and theoretically as well to get to that sort of solutions rather than just the technical side. So for me, the technical side of the causal inference is really in the surface.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
Of the substantive knowledge. It's fun too. I just enjoy it intellectually as well. Wouldn't be doing it otherwise.
And so after Harvard, you finished 2005. What was the next step? I believe you went to an assistant professorship at University of Michigan, right? Was there a postdoc between, or what was that? What was your choice?
I did have a 1-year postdoc at Michigan that was just sort of more of a soft landing there.
Okay.
Or time to get going, and I used that year almost entirely to convert dissertation chapters into articles and really get a big chunk of the book, the first draft of the book, Living the Drama Written, which is came out of my dissertation.
Right.
And then when I was there, I connected with Jeff Morinoff, who's still on the faculty there. And we started this larger project on prisoner reentry and the effects of incarceration. That once we started collecting data and built relationships with the Michigan Department of Corrections there to access more data, then that sort of branched off into multiple different pieces of it.
Right.
So both qualitative and statistical.
And so thinking about that time during your postdoc and perhaps starting the assistant prof position. So in terms of, going back to the writing question in the production phase, how was, basically roughly speaking, like how much time were you spending on the writing and thinking about like 7 days a week where you're spending, are you trying to be disciplined in, Mondays to Fridays, and I'm within this time frame, I'm actually writing, getting the stuff out, or was it, including the weekends and, maybe intruding somewhat family.
Oh, yeah, certainly in those days, I didn't have kids at that point. So, yes, there was a lot more time flexibility then, definitely intruding into evenings and weekends
Right. Right.
as well. I mean, that first postdoc year, I had, no other responsibilities
Yeah.
besides just writing.
Yeah.
And then, certainly as an assistant professor, public universities like Michigan and Berkeley, they're very good about protecting their assistant professors' time because, that's how they stay at the top, is by growing their own stars, in a sense, rather than, a Harvard or Yale or Princeton model where you just go buy a star that has already been.
Oh, I see.
Right?
Okay, it's like okay.
So those are great. Those sort of top public universities are great places to be junior faculty.
That's a good point. Yeah,
they're very supportive.
Yeah. And so you would be, I mean, if you think about, then you were sort of letting the weekends and evenings be whatever they were in terms of work. But today, are you trying to sort of, or is it like, how do you think about evening time and weekend time and family time?
Yeah, I mean, mostly it's sort of dictated by family time. That's one of the great things about being a professor is, especially once you have tenure, it's probably one of the most flexible jobs you could possibly have, right? Because you have an extreme amount of control over at least when you work, right? Yeah. And then, we often put a lot of pressure on ourselves to keep, to keep producing and, to keep training our students and things like that. So it's sort of working during the day, sometimes 7 hours or something like that, sometimes a little bit less when the kids are little, and then working in the evenings, and then these days in the evenings on the weekends to get things done.
One thing you mentioned that I really we are soon approaching the end of the conversation, by the way, David, but one thing I would love to touch about before we go into the ending theme of this conversation is what you mentioned about the universities being like, Harvard could, buy the stars, and those top public universities would actually grow the stars by giving them more chunk of time to work in. What would you say to, those individuals that might not be in either of those situations, but they are sort of striving to become better in terms of mastery? They might not be in the best conducive place to grow and become, sort of an internationally recognized scholar. How should they think about these questions?
Yeah, I mean, one thing one can do is to use the time one has to try to put oneself either physically or virtually, into those spaces. I mean, especially now with with colloquia and seminars being broadcast on Zoom, right? We have access to all these great talks and things like that are intellectually stimulating all around the world. Many of them also recorded, but also using the summers and whatever sabbatical you can scrape up to even put yourself physically, in these kind of environments, just to be around others and developing collaborations with others that will give you the opportunity to keep growing and of course producing more scholarship. I know it's easier said than done, of course, right, with all the constraints that we all have.
Yeah, fair enough. So, one of the, I mean, looking at your profile again, Dave, in terms of the portfolio of research that you have produced, and also leading the social science D Lab and other, among other things in computational social science, data science, and qualitative mixed methods research. I mean, I think that you have achieved many things already at sort of your level of seniority. But what, can you tell us a little bit about, the next sort of moves that you are perhaps doing for yourself, but also maybe at a higher level, at the discipline level, where you see the bigger picture questions, methods, and so on that social scientists, maybe in general, but maybe sociologists specifically, should be thinking about?
I mean, one thing I always try to do, I sort of hinted at this earlier, is when I do, new projects, to really choose them in a way that they're going to push me to learn something new. I mean, to me, it's almost selfish in the sense that, I want to keep things as interesting and as exciting as possible. I don't want to be doing the same thing over and over again. And so thinking about projects that will, be an opportunity to learn, because I think in this field, we have to be constantly learning new things if we're going to be producing new and interesting scholarship, right? So, my role as faculty director of the D Lab, I sort of almost fell into when the prior director needed to go on leave on short notice. They asked me to fill in, and then they made me the permanent director. And before I started that, I knew little to nothing about this world of data science. And so for the past few years, I've been using that as an opportunity to learn that and to really and then start teaching it in my own courses, and really think about like what are the ways in which we can we as sociologists can use these tools and methods, and how do they map on to the traditional things we've always done, and how are they really different? I mean, in a lot of ways they're just literally like language translation, but in a lot of ways they're fundamentally different. I mean, I think the most important one is that most data science or computational social science methods are actually inductive rather than deductive. So our traditional quantitative sociology paradigm is very classical statistics deductive, right? Hypothesis driven, whereas most many applications of machine learning, especially the way social scientists and sociologists can use them, say for example on text data, is actually very inductive. And so it really sort of flips flips a lot of our paradigms on its head, and sort of I think the most interesting thing is in the discipline, it's going to break this sort of binary between like qualitative inductive and quantitative deductive, because it quantitative but inductive, and of course has ways built in to ensure the rigor and reproducibility and p-hacking and things like that. So that's one of the things I'm really interested in right now is continuing to learn about that, and learning how machine learning can be applied to causal inference, and reading as much of that as I can, and I'm just sort of on the lookout for ways I can incorporate that into my own projects and use some of the data I've already collected, or work on projects that will give me the opportunity to keep learning that. It's
really hugely interesting. I mean, my own research is really sort of targeted towards sort of that development and interface of computer science and more of a sort of a global studies or development studies from a sociological, sort of political, economical point of view. So I'm extra excited in what you say in terms of developments here. And so, okay, so if you have a assistant prof or postdoc, basically you would say maybe like, well, should they? So maybe what would they? How should they get into this? By collaborating or by spending time learning themselves using these tools?
It just depends a little bit where you're starting from, of course. I think, it's a mix. I mean, there are some different technical skills you need to pick up, right? You need to be probably working in Python in some cases, or R, which is not, especially Python, not traditionally taught in sociology PhD programs. So that, of course, just takes some time, and there's, these days so many resources to learn those things online. But of course, you're not really going to learn it until you use it to do a project and just force your way through. Also there's a growing number of books, sort of textbooks, quasi textbooks, but also just reading collecting and reading papers that are applying
Mm.
these methods
Yeah.
to sociology or to the social sciences
Yeah.
more generally, and then looking for ways to apply those methods to some important question in sociology. It's the marrying of the substantive question and the method, right, to answer an important question that is going to both make your mark as a scholar, right, but also do that work of of pushing the discipline forward to use those methods more, right? If other people seeing, okay, this is allowing us to answer the questions that we've always been interested in, or the types of questions we've always been interested in.
Yeah. So Dave, maybe at the end now of our conversation, which is that you get basically the last question or challenge that you would want to pose to the listener of this interview.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my challenge would be to really think about first of all, what are you most enthusiastic about, right? And to really pursue that line of research. I think that's the most important thing, is because as I said, like the beginning of the project is great, but you're going to need that enthusiasm and that motivation of just inherent interest in that topic in order to push the project all the way through all the the challenges of any project. So I think the challenge is to decide for yourself, not what's the next thing that just came along, but what is it that you really want to spend your time working on, especially as a junior scholar when you're developing your own reputation, developing your own kind of foundation for the rest of your career.
That's a great challenge that I'll take with me, Dave.
Yeah, it's not an easy one.
It is not, but it's a critical one in the sense that many of us spend a good chunk of probably the rest of our lives on these questions, so it probably needs to be worthwhile, the efforts and the devotion. But Dave, it was a true pleasure talking to you here today and learn a bit about your journey and your thoughts about the path towards becoming better and better in what we do.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation and all your really thoughtful questions.
Thank you, Dave.